So once again, good morning and welcome to everyone. I'd like to begin this morning's session, our first session of the symposium, with an acknowledgement of country. So we acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands, waterways and skies on which Deakin University is situated, and we pay our deep respect to the ancestors and elders of Wadawurrung country, Eastern Maar country, and Wurundjeri country, where Deakin University's physical campuses are located. And we acknowledge all First Nations peoples who are contributing to our learning communities. So once again, welcome to the Swell Research Network's Spirituality, Wellness and Risks Symposium. And as Anna Fidel and Kim Knott argue, while there has been considerable recent research on religious diversity and the rise of the non-religious in so-called Western societies, but also globally, the ongoing popularity of spirituality is typically not taken as seriously by the scholarly community or by policymakers, certainly not in Australia, and internationally as well. So our Australian Research Council funded research on Australian spirituality, and this symposium aims to address this. And we're delighted to include so many esteemed and emerging scholars in this event and also in our new Swell Research Network. So I thank all of you for being here today. And we're going to circulate a link to the network website and to some of our recent publications after this session. And I'd also very much like to thank Rosie, Ruth and Sam, who are all here today, our team, part of our project team, for organizing the symposium and also for building the website. And so now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Laurie Beaman, who will chair this session. And Laurie is a chief investigator on our Australian Spirituality Project. Thank you again.
Good morning, evening, afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. I am on the unceded territory of the Passamaquoddy on the east coast of Canada. And I look to the Passamaquoddy as I negotiate my relationship with this territory in this land. I don't want to give lengthy introductions today, so we'll start right into the papers. The first paper is by Nancy Ammerman, and the paper title is Approaching Wellbeing and Risk Through a Lived Religious Practice Perspective. And I think I will say a little comment that I think Nancy's work has inspired many of us in the area of lived religion and many other areas as well. So Nancy, welcome. It's a pleasure to see you, and I'm looking forward to your paper.
Thanks. It's really a privilege to be here, and I hope my screen share has just worked and that you're seeing my first slide.
We are. Perfect.
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay. It's been really a delight to survey the wonderful array of research that we're going to be hearing about over these next couple of days. And it's clear that there's a good deal of consensus that secularization isn't the best framework for thinking about how humans pursue well-being, even if the policymakers seem still to be convinced of that. I won't rehearse all the reasons I've come to that conclusion, but it's worth noting two things. First, many of us have been invited to that conclusion by the expansion of our gaze beyond the North Atlantic, beyond white males, beyond the colonial powers, and into the worlds of women, Indigenous peoples, and others. That isn't something that's likely news to anyone here. The second point, however, is perhaps a little more contentious. I'm going to argue that the counter-secularization story, that is, the story about the rise of spirituality, may be just as much a privileged North Atlantic story, too often imagined as something chosen and individualized. Indeed, I'm going to keep using the old-fashioned term religion as the analytic or edict category that I think can encompass both the presumably dying institutions of the developed world and all the many other spiritual things we're going to be talking about. So here is a preview of what we're going to be doing. I'm going to, first of all, outline how I'm using lived religious practices as a theoretical framework, and then talk about using a multidimensional approach to practice, using vaccine hesitancy as an example. Then I'll argue that all of this depends on the particular legal and cultural contexts in which we're doing our work. And that means that however we understand spirituality, it has to be seen as a social practice. So, first, the definitions. When I talk about religion, the frame I'm using is based on understanding lived religion as a practice. That is, as something people do, and spirituality as one dimension of that practice. Indeed, the dimension that marks the practice as religious. When a sociologist says that religion is a practice, it simply means that a person is engaged in a pattern of activity that other people recognize, and that because there is this mutual recognition, people know how the script is supposed to go and what they're all supposed to do. That recognition, cognitive sorting, and responding is often something we don't even stop to think about. We just know. Recognition and response then comes to us already prepackaged and therefore constrained, but not totally so. There's also room to improvise. That is, these social patterns that organize our thinking and create our responses still leave room for the freedom and agency to act in new ways. One of the reasons we recognize an action as religious or spiritual action is because it has some relationship to something I'm going to call transcendent. That is, something more than everyday as a dimension of reality. That spiritual dimension can be either direct or indirect, immediate or mediated by institutions and traditions. It may or may not be personified as a deity. And likewise, spiritual reality may or may not be seen as powerful or interventionist or salvific. Asking for assistance isn't the only reason people are in relationship with a spiritual reality. That means that acting in relationship with spiritual realities may or may not happen in organized religious settings or according to set religious rules. And spiritual may or may not mean having ecstatic otherworldly experiences. In other words, people participate in all sorts of activities that may be recognized by themselves, that is an emic recognition, or by analysts, edict, as religious. What passes for religion in everyday assessment matters, but so do the things that bear a family resemblance to religion, but haven't been named as such. So the first challenge in understanding the risks and benefits of religious and spiritual practices is to think about that really broad range of things that religion encompasses. Once having established that more capacious definition for our exploration of religion, we can begin to take seriously that religious practices, like all social practices, are multidimensional experiences that need to be studied as such. As we acknowledge that religion is not just a set of ideas or prescribed ritual actions or official memberships, we can explore what people do with their bodies, how they feel as they do it, what objects and spaces they're surrounded by, and more. The dimensions I've been pointing to in my work encompass materiality, emotion, embodiment. Also embedded in action are moral judgments, aesthetic sensibilities, and a narrative arc that shapes the action, as well as that defining dimension of spiritual connection. To show how such a multidimensional approach to lived religious practice might be useful, I'm going to take the case of vaccine hesitancy and draw on the work of Kira Ganga-Kiefer, whose Boston University PhD dissertation, titled Pure Bodies, Sacred Authority, will soon be published by Princeton University Press. Here it traces the embodied sacred practices and rhetorics surrounding vaccination from their earliest days in the US, when inoculation against smallpox was the subject, to the most recent uproar over COVID vaccines. No matter which practices we're studying, attention to materiality is essential. Whether we're studying prayer cards and prayer shawls or rituals sacralizing ancient lands, the physical spaces and objects of both everyday and formal practice are part and parcel of lived religious practice. And in the case at hand, it matters that vaccines are physical things, material substances that are designated by opponents as sources of pollution. Whether it's the pus obtained from cows to combat smallpox, or the chemicals in DPT or measles vaccines, or the sophisticated creation that became a COVID vaccine, these substances are experienced as not just threats to health, but threats to purity, sources of evil and danger. Likewise, we need to pay attention to embodiment. No news to you, I'm sure. What we see and hear and smell and touch and how we move in space and visually present ourselves is integral to religious experience. Throughout the world, those bodily presentations, especially by women, are matters for public debate and legal challenges, as are questions about bodies and vaccines. Those who choose to resist vaccination not only abstain from taking polluting things into their bodies, but they also engaged in embodied practices, giving attention to healthy eating and attunement to the bodily functions of oneself and one's children. Those everyday rituals, Genga Kiefer claims, quote, actively preserve moral goodness, spiritual health, or divine oversight of the human body. Emotion is often less visible in religious action, but it is no less a part of what we need to be observing. What feelings do we expect to see expressed, and which ones surprise us? How do religious actions evoke and mediate feelings of stress or fear or grief? And how does religious tradition evoke and channel the emotions of everyday life? For those opposed to vaccines, it is often fear that is channeled into resistance, and feelings of triumph that are expressed when mother warriors, sometimes treated as saints and martyrs, succeed in defending their children. Perhaps even less studied are the aesthetic dimensions of practice. Whether they can talk about it or not, the things people choose to do are attractive to them. And the things we avoid are, at least in part, things experienced as ugly or repulsive. It pays to notice what people do to surround themselves with sights and sounds they experience as spiritually uplifting, whether it is architecture and clothing, or the pull of a beautiful natural landscape, or the pursuit of a beautiful, pure, healthy body. This aesthetic sense is at work in spiritual practice as well. The moral dimension of religious practice is, of course, much more visible. Religious action is itself often seen as morally good, but more importantly, it carries moral messages about how people should live. There are explicit teachings contained in sacred texts, and there are exhortations that are given extra weight by the ceremonies surrounding them. And often there's a claim that moral guidelines are matters of divine command. Now, this works on both sides of the vaccine issue. Public health leaders, of course, have their own moral message. They preach a command of individual sacrifice that is undertaken for the common good, and often elevate scientists and doctors to sacred status as the high priests of moral progress. Those who resist are by them dubbed immoral, crazy, and dangerous. But the resistors have their own definitions of goodness. They form moral communities around films and websites and gurus in which the hegemony of science is questioned, and medical interventions are equated with colonial interventions or other evil intrusions. The heroes and saints here are those who stand up for the intuitive knowledge of mothers and other wisdom keepers. Religious action often does all of this by way of the stories it tells. either implicit in the action itself or explicit in the narratives of the community. Whether formalized storytelling and religious ritual or everyday storytelling by elders and wise ones, people come to see and understand the world through the stories we tell. And those who resist vaccination have polished this dimension of their practice to a high art. Mothers who learned to testify on behalf of the children they believed had been hurt by DPT vaccines crafted narratives of transformation that Ganga Kiefer claims, quote, offered bereaved, confused parents a larger than themselves reason for their suffering. And more recently, conspiritualists have evoked apocalyptic tropes to describe the evil forces of big pharma and big government. To understand the religious character of vaccine resistance, then, we need the lens of lived religious practice. We need to see that these are actions that reach for a knowledge that is intuitive and remedies that involve rituals of purification accomplished and sustained by sacred mothers and martyrs in a moral community with its own narratives of transcendence. It is, in other words, a spiritual practice, even for those who are not part of the particular religious traditions that have been the sites of alternative medical care. So, approaching the study of religion as a lived everyday practice, characterized by spirituality, invites us to think deeply about these multiple dimensions of religious practice to better assess the points at which both benefits and risk may emerge. To do that requires not just close attention to the action we observe, however, but also awareness of the legal, cultural, and social situation in which that action takes place. That context sets the stage for what we see as normal and not worrisome, and what we don't see at all. It sets the limits for the opportunities available and expected, and the constraints within which religious and spiritual action occurs. I've suggested that those contexts can be grouped broadly into religious patterns I've labeled entangled, established, institutional, interstitial, I'm going to learn to say that word eventually, and post-colonial. Enlarging the study of lived religious practice means not only looking for the ways religion persists in individual spiritual experimentation in Western societies, but also exploring religious practice in other contexts. It pays to know where people think religion belongs and where they think it's out of its own lane. In places where religion is highly institutionalized, non-credentialed and nascent networks may be suspect. In places with current or past religious establishments, both lingering cultural customs and remaining regulations may still be in play. At their strongest, of course, legal establishments can involve significant constraints. Some religious practices are simply forbidden and others required. To imagine that people are simply freely choosing how to be religious is often a cruel misperception. In many places, those legal constraints have loosened in recent decades, and both seekers and immigrants are inhabiting these interstitial spaces, combining new and old ways of being religious. And in post-colonial contexts, societies once dominated by an imposed establishment from elsewhere are enthusiastically creating their own versions of those traditions, as well as bringing long-held practices into new settings, creating then a fascinating bricolage of colonial, pre-colonial, and post-colonial practices. These ideal types describe some of the typical contexts we may find in the world, but wherever we are, there are questions to be asked about the opportunities and constraints surrounding religious practices. What is permitted and what is forbidden? And how do expectations and constraints relate to the perception of risk or benefit? And in all these contexts, there will be internal constraints as well. Constraints based on gender, ethnicity, and social class. What women can and think they should do is simply not the same as the patterns of religious practice we see for men. The practices of people at the bottom of the status hierarchy are almost surely different from those at the top. And people always bring their ethnic and cultural selves to whatever lived religious practice in which they engage. Even within a given stream of tradition, then, the risks and benefits of any religious practice are unevenly distributed. Bottom line, winding up, any notion that the study of lived religion or spirituality is a matter of studying individual religion needs to be modified by all these sociological cautions. It is partly to avoid individualist assumptions that I continue to speak analytically of religion rather than just of spirituality. To assume an individualist perspective, I think, is to obscure often that the critical legal, cultural, and social structures that shape the choices that are possible and expected. So assessing the relationship between religious practices and well-being begins with the kind of deep exploration of those practices many of you are engaged in. Thinking about those practices as social, embedded in communities that recognize and sustain them, is essential, but so are the larger forces of law and culture that surround those communities. And sometimes it is the particularities of the practices themselves that provide the clues we need. The way they are material, embodied, emotional, aesthetic, and moral, the way they tell sacred stories, and the kind of spiritual presence they evoke. It's all of that that I'm going to be listening for in the coming days. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for that signal that you were winding up, because I didn't have to give you the two-minute warning. I just hoped that you were winding up, and you did a perfect job. So thank you so much for that. We will move actually to Verónica, because I don't think Renee is that correct, Rosie? Is Renee's not here yet still? Okay. All right. So, okay, Verónica, if we can call on you next. It's such a pleasure to meet you online. Verónica Giménez Béliveau from the University of Buenos Aires, Argentina, will present on conservative sensibilities in Latin American Catholicism, modern society risks, and traditional discourses for well-being. Thank you, Verónica.
Oh, thank you for the presentation. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I want to start expressing my gratitude to the organizers of the Symposium on Spirituality, Wellness, and Risk, especially to Ana Fof. It's a pleasure for me to exchange with you. I will present here my work on transformation in conservative Catholic sensibilities and subjectivities in dialogue with contemporary spirituality. The systematic study of spiritualities in the field of Catholicism has not received much attention from scholars. In Latin America, for example, studies on conservative Catholicism focus more on their relationship with politics and the state, and the construction of subjectivities is left out. These subjectivities express ideas and representations about the world, and also political, theological, and ideological positions, motivations, and dispositions. In this presentation, I propose to analyze conservative sensibilities in Latin American Catholicism. I am interested in highlighting here the dialogues between conservative Catholic sensibilities and the discourses of well-being and risk in the contemporary world. I will argue that conservative Catholicism is permeable, like other social spaces, to the spirituality circulating in society, and that the ideas of the body, the relationship with the environment, and the holistic perspective about the conception between human beings and nature is somehow related to New Age spirituality. So this presentation is based on the ethnographic research that I conducted among Catholics in Argentina between 2013 and 2022. I used also virtual ethnography during the time of lockdown And I work also with the identification of Catholic influencers and participation online in online rituals and meetings. So, well, first I will present briefly, excuse me. Okay, I will present briefly the context of Latin American Catholicism. The first point to highlight is the change in the position of Catholicism in Latin American societies in the last century. Catholicism ceased to be the hegemonic religion. Religious plurality generated new options for religious belief and belonging, and marked an opening toward new religious belief and new forms of spirituality. The percentage of Catholic decreased in Latin American countries. In Argentina, for example, it dropped from 90% in the 60s to around 62% in 2019. Catholicism is still the majoritarian religion in Latin America, although it shares the social space of religion and spirituality to other traditions. While conservative Catholic groups tend to sustain a discourse that emphasizes the truth of Catholicism and the unique role for the Catholic Church in the salvation of humanity, the issues of concern are in dialogue with other spiritual traditions. So, what are the central themes that define conservative Catholic subjectivities and activisms? The representation of conservative Catholicism about society assume that the Church guaranteed for centuries an ordered world. This social religious community ensured the happy life of humanity following natural laws. Modernity has attacked this ancient world by the advance of technology and the associated forms of social engineering, such as the modern states. The ideal of society is built from the Golden Age, located in a pre-industrial and pre-revolutionary society. The community ruled by church is the assurance of wellness. The family is the center of the order of this order. Families constitute a community of believers. Collective welfare takes precedence over industrial welfare, or over, individual welfare. In addition to the representations that make reference to the European Middle Ages, Latin America found the Golden Age in the colonial times. In the colonial America, native people coexisted with Catholic European people, founding a harmonious, hierarchical, and organized society. Oh, excuse me. I'm doing, okay, here we are. So I will talk to you about the central axis of conservative Catholicism, and these are three: the family at the core of the social organization, and then a certain idea of the body that is a wealth body, and the nature that should be protected from the excesses of capitalism. One of the first of the central axis of the discourse of conservative Catholicism is the centrality of the family. The family is the basis of Catholic social organization. The Catholic family is heteropatriarchal and hierarchical. It is based on the sanctified marriage between a man and a woman for procreation, which assures the reproduction of the faith. The centrality of the family gives an equally central place to women. The woman is the soul of the family. She sustains affectively and spiritually the community. This is why, for conservative Catholics, the progression of women's and sexual minority rights represent a risk. The advance of feminist movements attacks the family because it removes women from their reproductive responsibilities. For conservative Catholicism, the rights of women and minorities, such as contraception, abortion, same-sex marriage, are part of a plan organized by the hidden powers against the Catholic family order. As one of my informants, a pediatric physician told me, women are the target. The culture of death is reigning more than ever. The risk perceived by conservative Catholics is related to the end of humanity. The birth rate is falling due to the progress of contraception and abortion. And this is part of an organized population control plan carried out by the International Monetary Fund, Bill Gates, and George Soros, among others. Latin America is also the target, and population reduction would make possible the conquest of its natural resources. We see here how feminist sensibilities centered on the family are related to conspiracy theories circulated in Catholic milieux. The centrality of the family is the basis of anti-abortion activism, which spread in different countries in response to the spread of feminist movements. Associated with the pro-life activism, we can also find movements against state interference in the education of children. Don't interfere with my children. In Spanish, con mis hijos no te metas, is one of the motto of conservative Catholic activism, particularly strong in Peru. The anti-statism, the ideas against the state, develop alongside familism. The state should not intrude in the decisions of individuals because it goes against the natural laws on which Catholic values are based. And these statism ideas lead us to our second axis. Just as the state should not impose gender ideology in education and health, neither should it legislate to the beginning and the end of life. Our second axis is the representation of the body. The representation of the body are in dialogue with the ideas of life and family. The body, especially woman's body, is a sacralized receptacle of life, understood as a divine spark. In this sense, it is an object of regulation and care, healthy food, an orderly life, sexuality in the context of marriage, staying away from sexual, dietary, and occupational excesses are the rules that led to Christian living. The old Catholic anti-capitalism resurfaces in the discourse on the body, environment, and health. Excessive consumption is harmful and makes humans sick. Both the excesses of ultra-processed food, the excesses of hours dedicated to the production of money, and sexual excesses are dangerous for human life. The return to a simple, ordered, and regulated life is the utopian horizon of conservative Catholicism. The anti-vaccine hesitancy that flourished in pandemic times is related with these topics. in 2021, I interviewed a young activist that showed a strong hesitancy towards COVID vaccines, not towards other approved vaccines, but only towards COVID vaccines. So he told me, my immune system worked better without being locked up, doing sports, sunbathing, communicating, hugging my loved ones, sharing moments is more effective than vaccinating myself with a drug that we don't know what it contains, that is not sufficiently tested, and that is a source of money for the big pharma firms. Sorry, this is my translation, so perhaps there is something that is not very, very good. So, as we can see, the Catholic discourses of well-being are also in dialogue with contemporary society. The issue of the environment, climate change, and the global warming are incorporated into their discourse and reinterpreted in a Catholic key. Conservative Catholic associations appreciate outdoor activities and enhanced sports. The ideal of a healthy, well-fit body is in open nature is opposite to city life, which produces stress, overcrowding, poor quality jobs, and poorly paid work. The healthy countryside versus the corrupt city is an old cliché of the Catholic narrative, which reappears in today's conservative Catholic discourse. One of my interviewees told me how her life changed when she moved to a small rural town from the city of Buenos Aires. She changed her relationship with her job as a doctor, taking more time to understand integrally her patients. She started to work in a vegetable garden and to eat healthy and cheaper. The utopia of urban decentralization and to return to nature is in the Catholic discourse, and it is articulated with other representations of environmental care. Catholic groups perform campaigns to clean up mountains and beaches, conceived as action to restore nature ruined by the actions of capitalism. The thread that ran through this presentation was the attempt to establish a dialogue between conservative Catholic subjectivities and sensibilities and the representations of wellness and risk that circulate in society and in other spiritual traditions. We could conclude that for conservative Catholics, the family is the natural place of wellness. The care of life, the protection of natality, and anti-abortion militancy are articulated with the care of the environment and the ecology. Escape from the city, associated with pollution and corruption, is combined with representation of the countryside and nature as the place of well-being. The vindication of tradition appears as an identity option to the pluralism presented by modernity, and it is an alternative for thinking about reality. This conception of the world, the idea of risk, is associated with different features of modern society, the technological mediations between people and between the communication between people, the intervention of economic power and industry in the management of bodies and health, and state intervention in education and the family through legislation related to gender laws, such as abortion, same-sex marriage, gender identity, and also divorce. These interventions attack the natural laws, which are also the Catholic laws, the laws of the Church that conservative Catholic subjectivities choose to rule their lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Verónica. I'm not going to have a job to do tonight because everybody's keeping time so well. Thank you. Thank you very much. Perhaps the last paper, I'm not sure. I'm still hoping that Renee will arrive. For now, the last paper is by Géraldine Mossière from the University of Montreal, Global Spiritual Coaching, Local Legal Regulation, a discussion based on a comparative perspective. And Géraldine, it's nice to see you online. I think we're one province apart at the moment. If you're not in Australia, I don't know where you are, but hello and good evening and welcome.
Thank you very much, Laurie. I'm actually in Montreal. I'm leaving for Australia in 2 days, so we're still on the same time zone. I would like to thank Anna and the whole team for inviting me. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to present some of the exploratory fieldwork I have conducted thus far. So I'm going to start, and on June 3rd, 2022, the New York Times hosted a guest essay stating spiritual coaches are on the rise. Indeed, you can find many services of spiritual coaching on the web, like this woman who announces her community on Facebook that she's jumping into spiritual accompaniment, or this one who is already more organized and structured as a spiritual mentor. So the explosion of the market of well-being, as well as increased communication and visibility offered by social media, have given rise to new actors often called spiritual coaches. Of course, this is related to contemporary challenges and issues like global warming, pandemic, war, that have created widespread anxieties and increasing demand for tools that go beyond conventional healing modalities and institutions that are now perceived as insufficient. So spiritual coaches draw on a whole array of personal development techniques, esoteric rituals, as well as tools derived from psychological theories like nonviolent communication. By and large, these practices are based on a holistic definition of the human being, seen as a complex and integrated set of body, mind, psyche relationships, endowed with its own restorative potential. Needless to say that in many countries, spiritual coaching and practices have bad press, that their practitioners are often seen as charlatans or charismatic entrepreneurs with dubious skills. Yet, while the combination of holistic practices with conventional medicine varies across contexts, the therapeutic use of holistic practices is not new. They have historically coexisted with medical practices. Insomuch as they revive the spectre of the guru and abusive religious authorities in local imagination, spiritual coaches' activities are more or less strictly framed by local legal regulations that stem from the historical and social forces that shape each country. So in this communication, I will discuss the regulation of spiritual coaching and holistic practices in British Columbia and in Quebec, 2 Canadian provinces. Drawing on a very exploratory ethnographic fieldwork I have conducted in both provinces since 2021, I will report the way spiritual practitioners situate themselves in relationship to both legal and cultural frameworks, and how the latter frame their holistic practices and spiritual coaching. This could feed the discussion on how legal and cultural frameworks might impact the rising sector of spiritual coaching practices. So this presentation is based on a research project that Paul Bramadat and I have written for submission to SHREC, which is the Canadian Research Funding Agency for Social and Human Sciences. So why do we compare British Columbia and Quebec? So those 2 provinces are located on opposite sides of Canada, and they differ in terms of cultural substrates, but also in terms of the power of conventional religion. These variations stem from the historical and social forces that have shaped each province, including the anchoring of religion and its articulation with spirituality. In recent decades, BC and Quebec have both experienced a sharp decline in religious practice. However, the relationship to spirituality and the management of holistic practices have taken very different forms in each context. So, although the Canada Health Act establishes certain general principles, Canadian provinces hold most of the responsibilities for healthcare, so that disparities in the organization and coverage of services, as well as differences in the culture of care and the inclusion of spirituality and alternative approaches, are sometimes great. Great. So in Quebec, physicians' historical prestige is strengthened by the public authority of the College of Physicians, which supports the legal framework for holistic practitioners to connect with the public. So the Law 21 restricts certain activities associated with mental health and human relations to a set of practitioners linked to professional orders, like social workers, psychologists, for example. In BC, the legislative amendments adopted in 2000 were intended to abandon the historical concept of professional exclusivity, which prohibited anyone other than a member of the medical profession from performing certain services or procedures except by specific legislation. In effect, this means that many aspects of the scope of practice of each regulated profession may therefore overlap or be shared with those of other regulated professions, and in some cases be performed by unregistered or unregulated persons, like massage therapists or yoga teachers. So in sum, Quebec legislations tends to keep holistic practices at arm's length from the healthcare system, while in BC, there seems to be more opportunities for collaboration between the two approaches to health. So this presentation draws on an empirical qualitative research that had been conducted since 2021, and thus far has comprised an ethnography, face-to-face interviews, as well as case studies with participant observations. So data collected among spiritual coaches show a large diversity of profiles, each of them relying on specific techniques stemming from spiritual traditions, energy tools, shamanic rituals, psychology-derived practices. So my team and I could classify the 27 coaches we met according to the following typology. Basically, we have coaches that are centered around a charismatic and motivational individual, coaching that are inspired by scientific, medical knowledge and techniques, other coaching that are inspired by religious, spiritual, or shamanic traditions, coaching that are inspired by a spiritual master or esoteric techniques, coaching that directly focus on women, femininity, and sexuality. So all share a common approach based on the use of their own life and everyday experience to feed their teachings, create personal relationships and intimacy with their clients. So how do the spiritual practitioners we met situate themselves in relationship to local regulation in their own province? So in British Columbia, one coach said, there's no legal framework, thanks goodness for now. Another one said, it is the wild, wild west. Another one said, it's a perfect freedom and it's a necessary freedom because otherwise you're locked into the models that exist, whether that's psychiatry or psychology. Another one said, I'm very clear with people. This is not counseling, this is not therapy, we are doing coaching. And they know that. To do therapy, you need a master's degree and be part of an association. But I'm not aware of any legislation that says that I can't work with people who have had PTSD at all because I'm a coach. Another one, and this is maybe the most interesting, says regulation is a security, but diploma do not make good coaches. If people were a little more intuitive, a little wiser, they would find the right person to help them. In the absence of that, they go into a directory and they look for people with a bunch of letters. But how do you certify 35 years of meditations? I don't know. I mean, there's no certification for it. How do you certify wisdom or joy or knowledge? In Quebec, we met someone who said, we're not supposed to use that word care. I use the word consultation. Another one said, the orders here in Quebec are very protective of their market. That is why you see, I never go to someone and say, here's the diagnosis. Neither do I give advice. Another woman who had a very strong and lively speech about the order of psychologists that took her to court said, this right-wing extremist movement of psychologists order, they took me to court. Now I have a judicial record. And the last one said, we are in a reign of constraints of rules. We spend our time issuing orders, legislating, ordering, monitoring, denouncing, prosecuting. oh, just because they have an order or have a doctorate or something, it gives them a kind of legitimacy where we don't question their competence. I encourage people to say, if what I tell you doesn't resonate, if it distorts, if it tastes bad, if it makes you feel uncomfortable, I'll reimburse you. Float me, don't follow me, keep in touch with how you feel. So a few trends that emerge, I think I still have time. So whether in Quebec or in BC, the absence of regulation is celebrated or desired, especially on the basis that the legal norms cannot propose any appropriate framework to gauge spiritual expertise and competencies that are more based on intuition and ways of being than on know-how. Yet some coaches and knowledge abuse is perpetuated by other coaches. And the ones who have certificates of coaching propose an internal form of regulation with the creation of a sort of ethical charter delivered after following a class of ethics that would help them to distinguish them from self-proclaimed coaches. And this is not surprising in a context of high competition between the coaches. And in Quebec in particular, we saw strategies for protection from binding regulation with a heavy self-control on the semantics they use and good care of wording activities. I witnessed a coach who said, I'm a practitioner, I'm not a therapist. He said that to his client. And most coaches I met act underground. Of course, this comes in tension with the fact that they also need exposure to attract clients. Many coaches adhere to associations that are not professional orders, but can grant them a sense of financial solidarity and belonging. And some insurance companies would cover the fees of those coaches who gather in association. But the main issue would be how to get legitimacy and credibility when you have no legal ones. And this is an issue in Quebec and in BC. So most of the coaches we met rely and refer to scientific studies to support their approach, particularly on studies based on neuroscience, quantum physics, and psychology, like, for example, the benefits of yoga and mindfulness meditation. Most coaches are eager to train themselves and they gather many certifications, like in coaching techniques, for example, and they display those diplomas very ostensibly on their wall. Many coaches also distinguish the scope of their services from the conventional medicine by embracing a more global view of the person and their issue. So the quote of this informant is illuminating in this regard. So this one said, what's happened with trauma is there's been an explosion that shows that there are many ways to address trauma. Right now, conventional medicine are even using things like what we consider Schedule A drugs or whatever. So whether it's ketamine or whether it's MDMA or it's mushrooms or whatever it is, we have a whole new area of quantifiable research. We have evidence that these things are effective in curing trauma. So how is it that this is more effective than all the talk therapy or all of the psychiatric drugs more effective for these individuals? So this is a whole realm of inquiry. The most important thing is to recognize that psychiatry does not have all the answers. It may have some, that's okay. It does not have all the answers. So where I feel in, and the rest of the people out there that are supporting is say, there are other ways to look at trauma. There's physical, looking at the body, there's yoga, there's many things, and there's a spiritual coach approach as well, or there's a coaching approach, an emotional approach coming from the heart. So coaches stress their difference with conventional medicine and professional orders because they offer something else. So as a conclusion, I can say that, of course, the market for spiritual coaching and holistic practices is a fairly thriving, dynamic, and innovative alternative health industry, which is fooled by the limitations of the public health infrastructures in terms of access, provision of existential and spiritual resources, and public suspicion and dissatisfaction with them. Of course, the research we undertook takes holistic practices in a broad sense and more fine-tuning is needed regarding each technique. The cosmology, the natural principles, and etiology they draw on could help mitigate the results. For example, acupuncture enjoys more formal recognition as a complementary medicine than Reiki or esoteric clairvoyance. Also, we should not overlook the fact that historically speaking, spiritual and healthcare settings have been intimately entangled, and differentiation between both sectors mainly result from the consolidation of biomedicine at the expense of holistic practices. Today, conventional medicine tends to integrate, to some extent, holistic practices, healer services, or complementary and alternative medicine, as I will show in the presentation I will give in presence next week. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Géraldine, and thank you too for staying within time, which is going to leave